Have you ever felt a quiet shift inside you, so subtle you almost ignored it, yet so profound it couldn't be denied? It happens in those moments when life suddenly feels different. What once seemed important now feels shallow. What once consumed you no longer holds any weight. And beneath all the noise, a soft whisper rises, reminding you that something deeper is stirring. This is not coincidence. This is not random. It is the awakening of your soul. For so long, many of us live on autopilot, chasing goals, reacting to problems, moving from one distraction to the next. We follow routines, cling to roles, wear masks, and call it living. Yet deep down, something feels missing. It's like a thirst that nothing external can quench, a hunger that no success, no possession, and no relationship can ever fully satisfy. And then, one day, without warning, you begin to notice it. A pull, a call, a sense that life is more than the endless cycle of doing and wanting. You realize that the world outside of you is only a reflection of something vast within you. That moment, that subtle shift, is the very beginning of your transformation. It is your soul rising. When this awakening begins, it often feels both unsettling and liberating. Old patterns start to crumble. The things you once tolerated suddenly become unbearable. The noise of the world grows louder, but so does the silence inside. It feels as if a veil is being lifted, showing you truths you had always sensed but never dared to see. This rising of the soul is not about escaping the world or abandoning life. It is about seeing life with new eyes, eyes that perceive depth where before there was only surface, meaning where before there was only routine, and connection where before there was only separation. The Buddha once said, "As the lotus rises from the mud to blossom in the sun, so too does the awakened heart rise from the suffering of this world." And this is what the soul's rising truly is: a blooming, a breaking open, a revelation of the self beyond the self. You may not even realize it at first. It begins with small things, a longing for quiet, an unease in places that once felt comfortable, a sudden sensitivity to the falseness of things. You might not have the words for it, but you can feel it. A deeper truth is calling you. And that is why we are here, to explore the sacred signs that reveal when your soul is awakening. These signs are not theories. They are lived experiences, shifts in perception, transformations in the way you move through the world. They are the subtle fingerprints of spiritual growth, guiding you closer to wisdom, to compassion, and to peace. Think of it as standing at the edge of a vast ocean. You cannot yet see the horizon, but you can feel the pull of the tide. You know you are being called into something greater, something beyond fear, beyond doubt, beyond the small identity you once clung to. This is the start of a journey not outward but inward, not toward something new but back toward what has always been within you. And so, let us step gently into this exploration. Let us listen closely, not just with the ears but with the heart, because the truth is simple. Your soul does not rise with noise, it rises with silence. It does not rise with force, but with surrender. It does not rise in the future, it rises here, in this very moment. As we open the door to this journey, remember this: every sign you are about to hear is not something foreign or distant. It is already alive within you, waiting to be recognized. The awakening is not about becoming someone new, it is about remembering who you truly are. Take a deep breath. Feel the stillness beneath the sound of my words. Let your heart settle, because what follows may not only explain what you are experiencing, it may also confirm what your soul already knows. Your rising has already begun. When the soul begins to awaken, the very first shift you notice is your relationship with silence. What once felt uncomfortable now feels like home. What once felt empty now feels full. Think about it. For years, many of us have been conditioned to fear silence. We fill every pause with music, with conversation, with television playing in the background, with endless scrolling on our phones. We tell ourselves we just like the noise, but in truth, we are often running from the stillness, because stillness reveals what noise hides. But when your soul begins to rise, that changes. The noise of the world suddenly feels heavy, exhausting. Crowded places, shallow conversations, endless chatter, they no longer feed you. Instead, you find yourself seeking quiet corners, long walks alone, mornings before the world wakes up. Silence begins to feel sacred. It's in that silence that you hear yourself again, not the version of you that society shaped, not the identity you perform for others, but the quiet, authentic essence of who you truly are. And for the first time in a long time, you feel relief. This craving for silence is not about rejecting people or escaping responsibility. It is about remembering that peace has always been within you. As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. And silence is the doorway through which that peace enters. At first, it can feel unusual. Friends might say you've become too quiet. Family may not understand why you'd rather spend time alone than join in the noise. But you know deep inside that something has shifted. You are not isolating yourself. You are reconnecting with yourself. In solitude, the mind that was once scattered begins to settle. Thoughts that once raced now soften. You begin to observe your emotions instead of drowning in them. And slowly, like a lake becoming still after a storm, your true reflection appears. This is why many spiritual traditions, from Zen monasteries to forest hermitages, emphasize silence as the foundation of wisdom. Because only in silence can you hear the voice of truth. Only in silence can you see life clearly, without distortion. And the more time you spend in this quiet, the more you realize that silence is not empty at all. Silence is alive. Silence is full of presence, full of awareness, full of a wisdom that words cannot touch. Imagine sitting beneath a tree in the early morning. No phones, no voices, no rush. Just the sound of your breath, the rhythm of your heart, the whisper of the wind. In that moment, you are not doing anything, yet you feel deeply alive. That is the gift of silence. It awakens you to life as it is, unfiltered, unadorned, complete. And so, if you have been craving stillness lately, if you find yourself longing to step away from the chaos and simply be, you are not withdrawing from the world. You are rising above it. You are listening to your soul, and your soul is telling you, come home. This is the first sign, and it is more powerful than it appears. Because once you taste the sweetness of silence, you cannot go back. The world may still be loud, but you carry quiet inside you, and that quiet becomes your strength, your sanctuary, your compass. From here, everything else begins to change. As silence takes root in your heart, another shift begins to unfold. You start to notice that the life you once accepted without question no longer feels right. The shallow conversations, the forced smiles, the roles you played just to fit in, they suddenly feel heavy, like clothes that no longer fit. This is the second sign that your soul is rising. You can no longer tolerate what is false. Think about how often we are taught to perform, to pretend we are happy when we are not, to agree just to avoid conflict, to smile in rooms where our hearts are breaking. We wear masks because the world rewards appearances, but when your soul awakens, those masks suffocate you. Pretending feels unbearable. It doesn't mean you become harsh or unkind. In fact, the opposite happens. Your compassion deepens, but so does your clarity. You begin to see through the illusions, the empty promises of consumerism, the endless race for approval, the superficial roles that people cling to out of fear. And once you see through them, you cannot unsee. It can feel uncomfortable at first. Relationships built on convenience start to crumble. Work that once gave you status now feels meaningless. Small talk drains you. Gossip irritates you. Even entertainment that thrives on negativity feels like poison. You may find yourself walking away from people, places, or habits that no longer align with your truth. And that's okay. This is not rejection for the sake of rejection. This is liberation. You are no longer willing to trade your authenticity for acceptance. You are no longer willing to carry the weight of lies just to feel safe. You are beginning to live in alignment with your values, with your heart, with your soul. The Buddha taught that clinging to illusions is the root of suffering. When you peel back the layers of falsehood, you may feel raw at first, exposed, even vulnerable. But in that rawness, there is freedom. Because when you strip away what is false, only truth remains. And truth does not need validation. Truth stands on its own. It's like cleaning a mirror that has been clouded for years. At first, the dust and grime shock you, but as you wipe it away, you see clearly. You see yourself clearly. And yes, this clarity can change the way others perceive you. Some may say you've changed. Some may pull away because they are not ready for that same honesty. But those who remain, the ones who value truth over appearance, will connect with you on a deeper level than ever before. So if you feel that pull, if you are tired of faking, if you can't stand empty interactions, if you long for authenticity even when it costs you comfort, recognize it for what it is. It is not you becoming cold. It is not you becoming distant. It is your soul refusing to settle for illusions. And that is power. Because when you reject what is false, you make space for what is real. Real love, real peace, real connection, real life. This is the second sign, and it prepares the way for something even greater. A vision of life so alive, so connected, that it changes the way you see everything around you. When you strip away what is false, something remarkable happens. You begin to see with new eyes. Suddenly, the world around you is not just background noise. It is alive. Everything carries a spark. Everything holds a pulse. And this is the third sign of your soul's rising. You begin to see life in everything. It's as if the veil has been lifted. A tree is no longer just wood and leaves. It is a living being, growing, breathing, reaching toward the sky. The wind is no longer just air. It is a messenger carrying whispers across time. Even the smallest things, like the rhythm of raindrops on your window or the silent dance of light through the clouds, move you in ways you can't explain. What others dismiss as ordinary, you feel as sacred. This shift is not about sentimentality. It is about perception. Your soul is tuning into the interconnectedness of all things. You begin to understand that nothing exists in isolation. The bird's song is not separate from the morning. The river is not separate from the earth, and you are not separate from any of it. The Buddha once said, "If you truly see, you will understand that a single flower contains the whole universe." And when your soul rises, that teaching stops being poetry. It becomes your reality. Think about it. How many times did you walk past a flower without noticing it? How many times did you eat a meal without considering the countless hands, the rain, the soil, the sunlight that made it possible? But now, awareness sharpens, gratitude deepens. The simple act of breathing feels like a gift. The world transforms from something you use into something you belong to. And with this vision comes reverence. You stop taking life for granted. You begin to move slower, to listen deeper, to treat things with care. Even the smallest actions, pouring water, lighting a candle, closing a door, become infused with presence, because you recognize that every moment is alive. This is why so many who experience spiritual awakening describe a profound love for nature. The forest becomes a temple. The ocean becomes a scripture. The stars become a reminder that we are part of something vast and eternal. But it goes even further. You begin to see life not only in trees and rivers, but in people, even in those you once judged, disliked, or overlooked. Behind every mask, you sense a beating heart, a longing, a soul on its own journey. Compassion blossoms, not because you force it, but because you can no longer deny the connection. And yes, this sensitivity can feel overwhelming at times. You may find yourself moved to tears by a sunset, or by the suffering of a stranger, or by the innocence of a child's laughter. But this is not weakness. This is strength. Because to feel deeply is to live deeply. When your soul rises, you do not just exist in the world. You participate in its aliveness. You touch it, and it touches you back. And once you begin to see life in everything, nothing is ever truly ordinary again. This vision changes the way you live. It softens your heart. It deepens your gratitude. And it prepares you for the next unfolding. The moment when you begin to sense not just life around you, but a higher guidance within you, gently showing you the way. When your soul begins to see life in everything, another transformation unfolds, one that is both subtle and profound. Ordinary moments, the ones you used to rush through without thought, begin to shimmer with meaning. This is the fourth sign of awakening. You start turning everyday life into something sacred. It doesn't happen through rituals alone, nor through grand gestures of devotion. It happens quietly, in the way you breathe, the way you walk, the way you pour a cup of tea. The most simple actions become offerings because you are no longer living unconsciously. You are fully present. Think about how most of us live. We eat while distracted. We walk without noticing the ground beneath our feet. We speak without listening to the sound of our own voice. Life slips by in fragments, in haste, in forgetfulness. But when your soul rises, presence awakens. Suddenly, you cannot help but notice the miracle woven into even the smallest acts. Lighting a candle becomes more than just lighting a candle. It becomes an acknowledgement of light itself. Washing dishes is no longer a chore. It is a meditation on cleansing and renewal. Drinking water is no longer just quenching thirst. It is communion with the very essence of life. The sacred is no longer confined to temples or shrines. It is everywhere because you carry it. This is why Zen masters teach, when walking, walk, when eating, eat. Simple words, yet they point to a deeper truth. When you give your full presence to the moment reveals its holiness. And the beauty of this shift is that it does not require you to escape your life or change your circumstances. You don't need to retreat to a mountain or spend hours in meditation. Awakening does not mean abandoning the world. It means illuminating it. It means bringing awareness into the very life you are already living. A smile becomes sacred. A conversation becomes sacred. Even silence shared with someone becomes a prayer. And as this reverence grows, so does your sense of gratitude. Gratitude for breath. Gratitude for touch. Gratitude for simply existing. You begin to realize that you don't need more to feel alive. You only need to be here now. But there is another layer. By honoring the sacred in the everyday, you also honor yourself. You begin to treat your body with care, your thoughts with compassion, your relationships with tenderness. You no longer rush through your days as though life is something to be endured. Instead, you move as though life is a blessing, because you have finally recognized it as one. And perhaps the most powerful part of this transformation is that it spills outward. When you live with reverence, others feel it. Your calm presence soothes. Your mindful actions inspire. Without preaching, without forcing, you remind people of their own sacredness simply by the way you live. So if lately you've noticed yourself slowing down, breathing deeper, paying attention to the little things, don't dismiss it. That is your soul transforming your life from routine into ritual, from ordinary into extraordinary. Because the truth is this, nothing is truly ordinary. Life itself is the miracle, and when you finally see it, you begin to live as though every step, every breath, every heartbeat is part of a great sacred dance. This is the fourth sign, and it opens the door to something even deeper, the sense that life is not random, that behind the flow of your days, there is guidance, a higher intelligence, leading you exactly where you are meant to be. As your soul learns to see the sacred in the ordinary, another gift quietly blossoms within you. The storms that once pulled you into chaos begin to lose their grip. The confusion that once clouded your mind starts to clear, and what remains is a sense of clarity and calmness that feels unshakable. This is the fifth sign of awakening. It doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easy. Challenges still come. Loss still happens. The world outside may remain noisy, unpredictable, even chaotic, but inside you are no longer drowning. You stand steady like a mountain rooted deep in the earth, unmoved by passing winds. This clarity is not about having all the answers. It is about seeing things as they truly are. You no longer chase every thought, every fear, every opinion. Instead, you begin to discern. You can tell the difference between what matters and what doesn't, between what is real and what is illusion. Decisions that once felt impossible become simple because they are guided by inner knowing rather than outer noise. And with clarity comes calmness. Not the calmness of avoidance, but the calmness of acceptance. You realize you cannot control everything, and suddenly that truth doesn't frighten you, it frees you. The Buddha compared the awakened mind to a clear lake. When the water is still, it reflects the sky perfectly. But when it is disturbed, the reflection shatters. In the same way, when your soul rises, your mind settles. And in that stillness, life reflects itself clearly. You begin to notice that anger no longer burns as long as it once did. Fear no longer dictates every step. Even pain, though it still arrives, is met with a kind of gentleness. You no longer resist life, you flow with it. This calmness radiates outward. People sense it in your presence. They may not understand why, but they feel more at peace when they are near you. Because true calm is not something you fake, it is something you embody, and it comes from alignment with your soul. Of course, this clarity also comes with responsibility. Once you see clearly, you cannot pretend to be blind. You know when you are compromising your truth. You know when fear is trying to disguise itself as reason. And so, you begin to live more deliberately, more honestly, more courageously. If you've noticed lately that you are less reactive, less rushed, less easily disturbed, if you felt a quiet strength growing inside you even in the middle of storms, then recognize it for what it is. It is your soul rising. It is your soul anchoring you in the truth of who you are. And this clarity, this calmness, is not the end of the journey. It is the doorway into the final realization, the understanding that all of these signs are not separate pieces, but part of a greater awakening, the remembrance of who you truly are and why your soul came here in the first place. And so, as we come to the close of this journey, you can begin to see the thread that has been weaving through every sign, every shift, every quiet transformation. From the longing for silence, to the refusal of what is false, to seeing life in all things, to discovering the sacred in the everyday, to the clarity and calmness that now guide your steps, all of it has been leading to one truth: your soul is rising. This rising is not a destination. It is not a final point where you arrive and declare yourself awakened. It is a continuous unfolding, a remembering of who you are beneath the noise of the world. A soul rising does not mean you escape life. It means you embrace it more fully, with eyes that see, a heart that feels, and a spirit that knows. You may notice now that you are not the same as you once were. The old illusions no longer hold you. The old fears no longer own you. The old masks no longer fit. Instead, you move through the world lighter, freer, more attuned to the truth that has always been within you. And the beauty of this journey is that it never truly ends. Every day offers another invitation to rise higher, to go deeper, to live with greater love, greater presence, greater wisdom. So if you are listening now and you recognize yourself in these signs, if you feel the stirrings of silence, the pull toward authenticity, the reverence for life, the presence in the ordinary, the clarity within your being, know this: you are not alone. Countless souls across time have walked this path, and countless more are awakening now just like you. Your rising is part of something greater. It ripples outward, touching others, awakening them in ways you may never see or know. Every moment you live in truth, every step you take in awareness, every act of compassion you share, it all contributes to the great song of awakening that humanity is beginning to remember. So breathe deeply, trust your path, honor your soul, for you are rising, and in your rising the world rises too. And perhaps that is the greatest realization of all. The journey of the soul is not about becoming something new, it is about returning to what you have always been. Light, presence, love. Your soul is not just awakening, your soul is ascending, and this is only the beginning. If this message resonated with your heart, take a quiet moment to carry it with you into your own life. And if you wish to walk further on this path of wisdom and peace, I invite you to join our community here. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, where together we explore teachings that awaken the soul, calm the mind, and bring light into everyday living. May these words continue to guide you beyond this video. May they remind you that you are never alone on your journey. And may your soul keep rising, gently, beautifully, one breath at a time.